Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Following the recent UN Security Council session, tensions in Europe's east remain high. On September the 25th, Hungarian Gripen fighter jets scrambled from a base in Lithuania in response to Russian Su-30s, 35s and MiG-31s near Latvian airspace. Meanwhile, Germany has proposed using 140 billion euros in frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's military, raising EU consensus and repayment questions. NATO's military committee meets this weekend in Riga, Latvia to coordinate strategy. We speak with Olena Lennon, Adjunct Professor of National Security at the University of New Haven, on these developments. Professor, welcome back. Good to have you on again.
Thank you for inviting me back.
Pleasure. So, okay, let's start with Russian incursions into NATO airspace. We've seen this, of course, in Estonia recently, but now close to Latvian airspace and so on. What's going on? What do you make of those activities?
Well, clearly, these are not isolated incidents. There seems to be a pattern of deliberate attacks to test NATO's capabilities, response time, and resolve. Even though we don't know all the information, and these attacks seem to be ongoing. It was the most recent ones in Denmark. But it appears that there is a pattern of a coordinated hybrid operation that includes not just airspace violations, but also attacks on critical infrastructure, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, sabotage, and so on. So it seems that now is the time to come up with a proportional response from NATO allies, and also act in a coordinated fashion, with all hands on deck approach, because even though, investigations are still pending, I think one thing is clear: these are not isolated incidents, and these are deliberate provocations on Russia's part.
So it sounds like, as you say, an integrated and comprehensive hybrid warfare strategy across NATO countries, including the UK. So it's not just the Scandinavians and Baltic countries and the eastern flank of NATO, but the UK as well, with cyber attacks there on airports. So what should, in your opinion, NATO's response be to this coordinated attack?
Well, it's multifactored, of course, because it's not just one domain of operations. Much like the Russians are operating in multi-domain fashion, NATO's response should be proportional. Like I said, it should begin with multi-layered, multinational defense system that includes reinforcement of air defense in frontline states, with additional fighter jets, but also increasing rapid response teams on the ground, including mobile air defense teams, much like how the Ukrainians are now protecting their cities. They act in small units inside cities, and shooting down airborne targets, threats was what they can. So I think that it's time for Europeans, for NATO allies, for Western partners to be creative, to be acting in unison, in coordination, but also, most importantly, these responses have to be rapid. NATO is notorious, and the European Union institutions are notorious for prolonged deliberations, but unfortunately, given the speed, the tempo and scale of operations that the Russians have brought, now is the time to act more quickly. Now, that said, though, I have to point out, too, that it's not, as you rightfully pointed out, the violations of airspace are now not limited to frontline states like the Baltics and Eastern European countries, including Poland, but also in Ukraine's Western European partners. And I think the message here is clear. These are countries that are main supporters, main military aid providers for Ukraine. I think Russia's goal here is to distract and inflict multiple dilemmas on leaders and populations of these countries to for them to be fearful that they may not have enough capabilities to protect themselves. The goal here is to reduce military aid for Ukraine, and countries like Denmark and the UK are Ukraine's main supporters.
Right. Okay. So one of the things you talk about a multifaceted response. Well, I mean, Poland and Estonia have already invoked NATO's Article 4, which calls for consultations on what the response should be. Do you think Denmark should do the same? You mentioned Denmark. Of course, they've had a drone attack or drones entering their airspace. They haven't allocated the source precisely, but I think we can take a pretty good guess where they came from. Do you think Article 4 is a good idea?
Absolutely. I think that's the least that NATO allies can do. I think these deliberations and meetings should be ongoing. And as a matter of fact, I think that the level of urgency has to be elevated to where these sort of diplomatic threats and condemnations can finally be translated into concrete protocols, concrete plans for what exactly NATO will do if the next incursion occurs, who exactly will be shooting down these threats. So I think that Article 4 invocation is the very bare necessity, the first step. But it is time for conversations to be translated into action. And so far, we haven't seen any, concrete plans put together, or other than, Poland shooting down drones. But again, we're now beyond deterrence. Now is the time to put in place concrete defense plans, not just deterrence.
Is that what NATO's military committee is going to do when they meet in Riga this weekend?
I assume so. Like I said, I think given the intensity of these attacks in the last 2 weeks and a clear pattern there, I think that the ministerial representatives and also defense leaders will elevate the urgency of the response to where it's proportional to what we're seeing on Russia's part. I think the Russians are clearly trying to sort of sow fear and panic among European and Western leaders and populations and distract them from supporting Ukraine. I think all of these conversations and deliberations have to be considered in the context of ongoing attacks on Ukraine. And I think part of Russia's strategy here is precisely for the European leaders to be bogged down in protecting their own airspace and sort of overlook military needs in Ukraine. But I think those issues have to be considered together as issues of European security that include Ukraine's security.
Understood. Now, one of the things you mentioned was the slow pace of decision-making and action-taking by NATO and the EU. One thinks of Hungary and Slovakia, who tend to be rather close to Putin's Russia at the moment. Are they part of the reason that it's going to be difficult for NATO to take a unanimous decision on the response to these provocations?
Well, I definitely think that Hungary and Slovakia are only part of the problem, but there seems to be generally in among Western capitals a little bit of a slow cognitive bias or sort of self-delusion that Ukraine, that the war will be contained in Ukraine, that the Russians will not escalate beyond the Ukrainian borders. So I think it's a combination of factors. Some of it is a psychological effect. It's they trying to avoid military confrontation. But that said, I don't necessarily think that Hungary and Slovakia are stumbling blocks here, because with proper incentives, I think Hungary and Slovakia can be incentivized to cooperate. We have seen examples of Europeans providing the right incentives to particularly Hungary to cooperate. I think political will. Europe has the resources to bring everybody on board. What's lacking is political will and a willingness to sacrifice some of domestic resources and domestic economies in the name of European security. Unfortunately, like I said, Europeans are more reactive than proactive. But the good news is that the resources are there. The Europeans are absolutely capable of providing a proportional response to Russia, and they're capable of incentivizing Hungary and Slovakia accordingly to kind of steer them from Russia's influence.
Understood.
What's lacking, like a
Understood. Professor, in the last minute or so, Chancellor Merz of Germany has proposed using frozen Russian assets to provide 140 billion euros of aid material, military material, to Ukraine. Very briefly, how will that work?
Well, there are different models being discussed right now. I know they're trying to avoid the word confiscation. So I think the most recent model being proposed is to use these frozen assets as a loan default, so to as repatriation. In particular, when the reconstruction begins, that this money can be used to fund reconstruction efforts. So I know at the moment the most important thing is to avoid the precedent of confiscation, and I have seen very hopeful and optimistic proposals that in fact will allow Europeans to unfreeze that money without confiscating them from Russia.
How will it be repaid?
I'm sorry?
Because I understand this is a loan as opposed to simply releasing the Russian money that's in Belgium at the moment. So how will this loan be repaid?
The idea is, my understanding is that once, when the war is over, that the Russians will be paying reparations to compensate for all the damage that they had done to Ukraine. So the assets will be Russian frozen assets right now will be used to secure those reparations. So it's either the Russians are paying reparations or their frozen assets will be used in place of reparations.
Understood.
That is the model. That is the model that is being discussed right now.
That is currently being discussed. Yeah, we shall see whether reparations are payable or whether those funds will need to be unfrozen. Professor Lennon, thank you very much indeed, as always, for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.